If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because you are about to hear what happens when a man everyone buried alive walks back through the front door of his own life. My name is Walter Hale. I am 63 years old, and 9 months ago my only son stood in a Colorado courtroom, raised his right hand, and swore under oath that he watched me die. He lied. And on the day of his wedding, while the priest was still waiting on his answer, I walked down the aisle myself. Before I tell you how a dead man crashes a wedding and wins, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I spent 35 years building something out of nothing. I started as a structural engineer inspecting bridges for the state of Colorado, the kind of job where nobody remembers your name unless something collapses. By the time I was 40, I had used everything I understood about risk, tolerance, and failure points to start a small private investment fund. I was good at spotting the crack in a structure before anyone else could see it, whether that structure was made of steel or a balance sheet. By the time I was 55, Hale Capital managed just under $400 million, and I had raised one son almost entirely alone. My wife, Eleanor, died when Derek was 11. Ovarian cancer, fast and merciless. The kind of loss that doesn't leave room for grieving properly because a child still needs breakfast made and homework checked. I never remarried. I told myself, and I told Derek, that the two of us were enough. I coached his baseball team even though I hated baseball. I sat in the front row at every school play even when he only had 2 lines. I built my company so that one day it would be his, not because he asked for it, but because it felt like the only inheritance that could replace what he lost at 11 years old. Derek is 29 now. Sharp, charming, restless in the way that young men with too much comfort and not enough hardship tend to be. He joined Hale Capital 3 years ago as a junior partner, though everyone in the office, including Derek, knew the title was generous. I loved him the uncomplicated way a father loves a son, which is to say, I forgave things I should have questioned. I forgave the missed deadlines. I forgave the way he sometimes rolled his eyes when I explained a position he'd already decided was beneath him. I forgave, most of all, his engagement to Vanessa Kirkland. Vanessa's family owned a luxury real estate brokerage that sold penthouses to people who had never once worried about a mortgage. She was beautiful in the calculated way that takes a great deal of effort to look effortless, and she had a talent for looking directly through me at family dinners, as if I were a line item she hadn't yet decided whether to approve. I told myself I was being an overprotective father. I told myself love makes people foolish, and my son was allowed to be foolish once. The last normal weekend of my life was in early spring. I flew to a fishing lodge outside Talkeetna, Alaska, alone, the way I did every April, a tradition I'd kept since Eleanor died, because the silence up there was the only kind of silence that didn't feel like loss. I chartered a small bush plane, a single-engine Cessna, piloted by a local named Gus who'd flown that route for 20 years without incident. We left the lodge at 7 in the morning under a clear sky. 40 minutes in, the sky wasn't clear anymore. I remember the plane dropping, the way your stomach drops on the first hill of a roller coaster, except it didn't stop dropping. I remember Gus shouting something about the engine and the wind shear. I remember the trees coming up fast, a wall of black spruce rushing toward the windshield, and then I remember nothing at all. I woke up 3 days later in a one-room cabin 60 miles from the nearest paved road, on a cot with a quilt made of old flannel shirts pulled up to my chin. My chest was wrapped in gauze, 2 ribs broken, a fractured collarbone, and a concussion severe enough that for the first several hours I couldn't remember my own last name. The woman who found me was named Nadia Sorensen, 71 years old, a widow who had lived off-grid in that stretch of Alaskan wilderness for over 30 years since her husband died there. She had heard the crash, followed the smoke, and dragged me a quarter-mile through the snow on a sled she used for hauling firewood. Gus did not survive. Nadia had no cell service, no landline. A radio that worked when the weather cooperated, which in April it rarely did. She had medical training from her years married to a bush doctor, enough to keep me alive. Not enough to explain to search and rescue exactly where I was, because she didn't know how to reach them either. For the first 6 weeks, I could barely form full sentences. My memory came back in pieces, disordered, like a puzzle dumped out on a table with half the box missing. I knew my name. I knew I had a son. For a long time, that was all I had. Search and rescue found the wreckage of the plane 11 days after the crash, burned and folded into the trees 30 miles from where Nadia's cabin actually sat, because the wind had carried the plane far past where it had first started to fall before I was thrown clear on impact. They found what they believed were Gus's remains. They did not find mine. The search continued for 6 weeks in brutal Alaskan terrain before it was called off. I was declared missing, presumed dead, in a preliminary report filed by the Alaska State Troopers. What I didn't know, lying in that cabin slowly relearning how to tie my own shoes, was what was happening 4,000 miles away in a courtroom in Denver, where my brother Roy had already retained an estate attorney. Roy is 9 years younger than me, and for most of our lives that distance felt like a canyon. I built Hale Capital. Roy built a string of failed ventures, a wine import business, a boutique gym, a cannabis dispensary that lost its license in the second year, each funded, in part, by loans from me that were never fully repaid and never fully forgiven either, at least not by Roy, who carried the debt like a grudge instead of an obligation. Roy had spent 15 years watching his older brother succeed and calling it luck. When I went missing, Roy did not see a tragedy. He saw an opening. Under Colorado law, a person missing under circumstances that suggest death, such as a plane crash with confirmed wreckage and one recovered body, can, in rare cases, be declared legally dead far faster than the standard 7-year waiting period if a court finds sufficiently compelling evidence that death, though unconfirmed, is the overwhelming probability. It is meant for cases exactly like mine. It is also, as I would come to learn, a process that can be rushed, greased, and manipulated by a man with money and no conscience. Roy had a friend from his gym days, a man named Curtis Boone, who happened to sit on the review panel for exactly this kind of expedited petition in the county where my legal residence was filed. I never learned the full extent of what changed hands between Roy and Curtis Boone, and by the time I did learn some of it, my lawyer told me it would be nearly impossible to prove in court. What I do know is this. 5 months after my plane went down, a Colorado probate court issued a preliminary death certificate for Walter James Hale, based on testimony that included Roy's account of a phone call he claimed he'd had with Alaska State Troopers, describing debris and personal effects that, according to the trooper Roy cited, were never actually recovered. The trooper's name on the filing did not match any trooper assigned to the case. Nobody checked. Nobody had reason to. With that death certificate, Roy, named as executor of my estate in a will I had written a decade earlier, before I fully understood what my brother had become, took control of Hale Capital's holding trust, and my son Derek, my only heir, inherited everything else: the house, the investment accounts, the art collection Eleanor had spent 20 years assembling, $61 million, give or take, depending on the day the markets moved. I found all of this out the way you find out most things that were kept from you on purpose, by accident, and far too late to feel anything but rage. It took me 4 months to become myself again in that cabin. Nadia never once asked me for anything in return for saving my life. Not money, not thanks that sounded rehearsed, nothing. She fed me broth when I couldn't chew. She read to me from a water-stained paperback of Moby Dick when the headaches made it too hard to focus my eyes on anything myself. When my memory started returning in full, and I told her who I was, that I had a company, a son, a fortune, she looked at me for a long moment and said something I have never forgotten. Money's easy to find again if you're the kind of man who built it once already. What I want to know is whether you're the kind of man worth saving. I told her I hoped so. I am still not entirely sure I've earned the right to say yes. By early September, I was strong enough to walk the 11 miles to the nearest ranger station with Nadia at my side, refusing to let me go alone. The ranger who greeted us, a young woman named Priya Chandra, looked at me the way you look at a ghost, because in every system that mattered, a ghost is exactly what I was. It took 2 days of phone calls, faxed medical records from Nadia's late husband's old clinic files, and a fingerprint match run through the state database before anyone believed that Walter Hale, presumed dead in a plane crash 5 months earlier, was standing in a ranger station in Talkeetna, Alaska, very much alive. I did not call Derek that night. I want to be honest about that because it matters to everything that came after. I had every legal right, every emotional right, to pick up that ranger station phone and call my son and tell him I was alive. I did not. Because somewhere in those 4 months of silence, staring at the ceiling of a cabin that smelled like wood smoke and pine, a small, cold thought had started forming in the back of my mind, one I was ashamed of and could not shake. If my death had been declared this quickly, this cleanly, someone had to have pushed for it. And the only two people who stood to gain anything from my death were the only two people I would have called first. So instead, I called Frank Delgado. Frank had been my attorney for 22 years, since before Hale Capital had its second employee. He was 68, half retired, spent most of his time now on his boat in San Diego rather than in a courtroom, but Frank was the only person left in my life I trusted without question, because Frank had never once asked me for anything either. When Priya Chandra handed me the ranger station phone and I dialed his number from memory, there was a long silence on the other end after I said my name. "Walter," Frank finally said, his voice thick. "They had a memorial service for you in June. I gave the eulogy." "I know," I said. "I need you to not tell anyone I'm alive yet. Not Derek, not Roy, nobody." Another silence, longer this time. Frank had drafted my will. Frank knew, before I even said another word, exactly what kind of conversation this was about to become. "Walter," he said slowly, "what happened to your estate happened fast. Faster than it should have." I read about the filing. I had questions about it myself, but I wasn't your attorney of record on the probate side. Roy hired a new firm the moment you went missing, and there wasn't anything I could point to that looked illegal on paper. "I need you to become my attorney of record again," I said, "today, and I need you to find out everything about how that death certificate got approved in 5 months instead of 7 years. Quietly." Frank was on a plane to Anchorage the next morning. What Frank found over the following 6 weeks, while I stayed hidden in a small extended stay hotel outside Anchorage that Nadia helped me check into under a name that wasn't mine, using cash from a small emergency account Nadia kept buried behind her cabin that she insisted on lending me, was worse than I had let myself imagine. The falsified trooper testimony. The financial records showing Roy had wired Curtis Boone $18,000 in 3 separate transactions in the 2 months before the death certificate was issued, disguised as consulting fees for a business venture that did not exist. And buried in an email thread Frank obtained through a records request that Roy's new attorney had sloppily failed to redact properly, a message from Derek to Roy, sent 4 months after my plane went down, that I have read so many times I could recite it from memory even now. "Roy, I know this is fast, and I know it feels wrong, but I talked to Vanessa's dad. And if we can get the estate settled before the wedding, it changes everything for us. The Kirklands are old money. They expect a certain kind of wedding, and I can't keep telling Vanessa we're waiting on paperwork. Dad would understand. He always wanted me set up. Let's just get this done. Dad would understand." 4 words that told me everything I needed to know about how little my son had ever actually understood about me. I sat in that hotel room outside Anchorage with Frank's printout in my hands, and I did not cry, and I did not throw anything, and I did not call my son and scream at him the way some part of me wanted to. I thought about the years I spent teaching Derek that pressure reveals character, that you find out who a person really is, not when things are easy, but when something breaks. I had been teaching bridge engineering to a boy the whole time, and I had somehow never once made him understand that the same principle applied to people. Now the bridge had broken, and I had watched, in black and white, exactly what my son was made of underneath the weight. Frank asked me what I wanted to do. I told him the truth. I didn't know yet, but I knew I wasn't ready to walk back into my old life and simply announce that I was alive. Not until I understood exactly how far this went, and not until whatever they had built on top of my supposed grave was standing tall enough that its collapse would mean something. "There's a wedding," Frank said carefully, watching my face. "Vanessa's mother mentioned it to my wife at a fundraiser last month before I even knew you were alive. Derek and Vanessa are getting married in December. 6 months from now. It's already being called the wedding of the year in that circle. The Kirklands are sparing no expense. I looked at Frank for a long moment. Outside the window, the first snow of the Alaskan autumn was starting to fall, and somewhere 4,000 miles south, my son was planning to marry into old money using new money he had stolen from a man he'd told his own fiance's father would understand. Good, I said quietly. Let them build it as big as they want, because a structure only teaches you something true about itself the moment before it falls. And I intended to be standing exactly there, in the doorway when that particular structure came down. I flew back to Colorado in late September, not as Walter Hale, but as a man Frank introduced to a private security firm as a consultant doing sensitive due diligence. Frank had a friend, a former Denver PD detective turned private investigator named Marcus Webb, a man built like a retired linebacker, with the patience of a man who had spent 20 years watching people lie to his face and learning to wait them out. Marcus became, in a strange way, the second person outside my own blood who I trusted completely during those months, the closest thing I had to a chorus watching the whole thing unfold beside me, shaking his head at the audacity of it more than once. I grew out my beard, let it come in fully gray, cut my hair shorter than I'd worn it in decades, and traded my usual tailored jackets for the kind of forgettable fleece and flannel that makes a man invisible in a Colorado suburb. Nadia had been right about one thing. I had spent 4 months in a cabin learning what it felt like to be nobody, and it turned out that skill was useful for more than just surviving a plane crash. It was useful for watching your own funeral procession from a safe distance and understanding exactly who had been crying and who had simply been performing grief for an audience. The house Eleanor and I had bought in Cherry Hills, the one Derek now legally owned, still had my name on the mailbox when I first drove past it, slow, at dusk, 3 weeks after I'd landed back in Colorado. That detail cracked something open in my chest that I hadn't expected. Not the $61 million, not the falsified death certificate, a mailbox with my name still on it, because apparently changing it hadn't been worth Derek's time. Marcus Webb had a simple philosophy about people who think they've gotten away with something. Give them enough rope, he told me over coffee in a diner outside Littleton, the kind of place where nobody looked twice at 2 men in flannel, talking quietly in a corner booth. Guilty people don't stay quiet forever, Walter. Especially rich, guilty people. They need someone to know how clever they were. It eats at them if nobody's watching. He was right. It took less than a month. Roy had moved into the guest house on the Cherry Hills property, the same guest house he used to stay in during holidays, when I was alive, and it was still called Generosity instead of Occupation. Marcus working a legitimate contract. Frank drew up under the pretense of a security audit for the estate. Since Frank was still technically counsel of record and could authorize certain access, installed a small recording device inside a smoke detector in the guesthouse den, the same kind of device, I would learn later, that Roy himself had once used to record a business partner he was trying to squeeze out of a gym franchise years earlier. There was a kind of poetry in that I chose not to examine too closely. The recording that mattered most came on a Tuesday night in late October, 6 weeks before the wedding. Roy had been drinking, which Marcus told me was becoming a nightly habit, the particular kind of drinking men do when guilt has nowhere left to go but down a glass. Derek had come by the guest house that night, agitated about something, and their conversation. Once Marcus handed me the audio file, and I sat alone in my hotel room and pressed play, confirmed everything Frank's paper trail had only suggested. The venue deposit alone is $240,000, Derek's voice said. Tight with stress. Vanessa's mother keeps adding things, the florals, the orchestra, some ice sculpture nonsense. It's spiraling, Roy. So let it spiral, Roy's voice answered, slurred but clear enough. That's the whole point, isn't it? You marry into the Kirklands, you look like old money. Nobody ever finds out how fast we had to move to get Walter declared before the estate got tied up in some review. Boone already flagged the file for a routine audit next year. Standard procedure on any expedited petition over 10 million. As long as it's settled and the money's moved before anyone digs deeper, it's done. Case closed. Nobody unwinds a wedding 6 months after the fact just because some bureaucrat gets curious a year later. And if someone does dig deeper, Roy laughed, the kind of laugh that had no humor in it at all. Then your father's dead, Derek. Dead men don't file complaints. That's the beauty of it. We didn't kill him. We just helped the paperwork catch up to what the mountain probably already did. Stop feeling guilty about a corpse nobody ever found. I sat with that recording for a long time before I played it again. Then I played it a third time. Roy's voice was one thing. I had never trusted my brother the way I trusted almost anyone else, and some small, tired part of me wasn't even surprised. But it was Derek's voice, the tight, anxious, complicit silence in his responses, the fact that he argued about the spending and not about the lie itself, that told me something I had been avoiding admitting since the ranger station in Talkeetna. My son was not an innocent man being manipulated by a greedy uncle. My son was a willing partner who had simply let someone else say the ugliest parts out loud so he wouldn't have to. Frank filed the recording, along with the falsified trooper testimony and the wire transfer records, under seal with a Denver probate judge named Corinne Ashworth, a woman Frank had appeared before a dozen times over the years, and trusted to move carefully rather than quickly. The petition asked for something unusual, not an immediate reversal of the death certificate, but a sealed order allowing Walter James Hale to be legally confirmed alive on a delayed timeline of Frank's choosing, with a temporary freeze quietly placed on any further liquidation of estate assets, filed under seal so that neither Roy nor Derek would be notified until the order was ready to be executed. This is unusual. Judge Ashworth told Frank in chambers, according to what Frank relayed to me afterward. Normally, the moment we confirm a presumed dead individual is alive, we notify the estate immediately. That's standard practice, and frankly, it protects the estate's beneficiaries from exactly this kind of manipulation. Your Honor, Frank said, my client is aware of that standard, and he's not asking you to violate the law, only to use the discretion the law allows you in cases involving suspected fraud on the court. He wants 60 days. He has reason to believe that immediate notification will simply allow the parties involved to destroy evidence and reposition assets before the fraud investigation can be completed. He is prepared to personally guarantee, in writing, that he will present himself to this court and confirm his status no later than the 60-day mark, regardless of what he learns in the meantime. Judge Ashworth studied Frank for a long moment. And what does your client intend to do with 60 days, Mr. Delgado? Frank told me later he had chosen his words to her very carefully. He intends to watch what people do when they believe no one is watching, Your Honor. And then he intends to be standing in the room when they find out he was. She granted the order. 60 days, sealed, with a hard deadline in mid-December that Frank and I both knew, without saying it out loud. Fell exactly 1 week before the wedding. What followed was the strangest 2 months of my life. Stranger even than the 4 months in Nadia's cabin. I lived less than 40 minutes from my old house, closer to my own son than I had been in years, and he had no idea I existed. I watched, through Marcus Webb's careful surveillance and Frank's legal maneuvering, as Derek and Vanessa spent money that was never rightfully theirs on a wedding designed to announce to Denver society that the Hale fortune had passed cleanly and impressively into a new generation. I made myself do something during those weeks that cost me more than any of the financial calculations Frank and Marcus handled on my behalf. I drove past the Cherry Hills house on a Sunday afternoon and saw Derek in the driveway, washing a car that used to be mine, laughing at something on his phone, looking lighter and happier than I had seen him look in the 2 years before my plane went down. Somewhere along the way, in a life built on top of my supposed grave, my son had found a kind of ease he'd never had while I was alive to disappoint him with expectations. That realization sat in my chest for days. I had spent 30 years so focused on not repeating my own father's cold, demanding silence that I had somehow built a version of fatherhood so accommodating, so endlessly forgiving, that my son had learned he could survive almost anything, including my death, without consequence. I did not confront him. Not yet. Frank had been right that patience was its own kind of weapon, and Marcus had been right that guilty people eventually give you more rope than you need. Instead, in the last 3 weeks before the 60-day deadline, I did something that surprised even Frank, who by that point had spent enough decades around me to think he understood how I made decisions. I let the wedding grow. Through a shell entity Frank set up, technically unconnected to me on any public document, I quietly purchased the mortgage note on the venue Vanessa's mother had selected, a converted 1920s ballroom downtown that had recently changed hands after its previous owner defaulted during a rough stretch 2 years earlier. It cost less than I expected, because the building's finances were shakier than its marble floors let on, and it gave me something Frank warned me was legally aggressive but not, strictly speaking, illegal. Leverage over the one location where I already knew, with absolute certainty, my son and my brother would both be standing in front of witnesses on the day of the wedding. I also did something Marcus advised against and Frank tolerated only because he'd learned over 2 decades that once I made a decision, arguing against it wasted time better spent preparing for it. I had Marcus quietly reach out to a florist Vanessa's mother had already contracted, a small independent shop struggling after a slow wedding season, and offer through an intermediary to cover the full cost of an upgraded order. Orchids flown in from Ecuador, an arrangement 3 times larger than what had been agreed, at no cost to the family, provided the florist simply confirmed the order was already fully paid and made no mention of who had actually funded it. I did the same, in smaller ways, with the catering company and with the string quartet that became, at my quiet expense, a 12-piece orchestra. I was not being generous. I understood exactly what I was doing, and so did Frank, who told me once, quietly, over dinner in late November, that he wasn't sure whether to be proud of my discipline or worried about what it revealed. I was building the tower as tall as I could make it stand, because a fortune stolen and spent in secret only teaches its own particular lesson when the theft is discovered at the height of its display, not in the quiet privacy of a courtroom filing months later that most of Denver's society would never even read about. Roy, of course, had no idea any of this was happening. Neither did Derek. What they knew was that money kept arriving to smooth over problems that should have caused real strain on an estate that, by every account they had access to, was still recovering from probate transfer costs and the usual complications of settling a $61 million inheritance. Derek mentioned it once, in a recorded conversation with Vanessa that Marcus captured almost by accident, sitting in her car outside the venue after a walkthrough in early December. "I don't even understand how we're affording half of this," Derek said. "I told my accountant we needed to slow down, and somehow things just keep getting more expensive and more paid for at the same time." "Don't question it," Vanessa answered, and there was something in her voice, light and practiced, that told me this was not the first time she had said those exact words to him. "Some things are just meant to go right, Derek. Your father built this family a lucky streak. Might as well enjoy it." Lucky streak. I sat with that phrase for a long time after Marcus played me the file. Somewhere in the last 6 months, my death had become a stroke of good fortune in the story my son was telling himself, rather than a lie he had helped bury under falsified testimony and $18,000 paid to a corrupt panel reviewer. I understood then, with a clarity that felt almost merciful, that I was no longer trying to save a relationship with my son. I was documenting the precise moment it had already ended, so that when I finally stood in front of him again, neither of us would be able to pretend otherwise. Frank filed the notice to unseal the court order on December 9th, exactly 60 days after Judge Ashworth had granted it, with a formal date attached for a hearing on December 16th, 4 days before the wedding. The notice would go, by law, to Roy as executor of the estate and to Derek as primary beneficiary the moment the order was unsealed. Frank gave me a choice that week that I have thought about often since. "We can serve this quietly," Frank said, sitting across from me in his home office, the same room where he had drafted my original will 15 years earlier. "Let the courts handle it. Let Roy and Derek get the notice through their attorneys. Let this whole thing unwind through paperwork, the way these things are supposed to unwind. You could avoid the wedding entirely, Walter. Nobody would blame you for that. Nobody would call you cruel for simply letting the law do its work without theater. I thought about Nadia, 60 miles from the nearest paved road, asking me whether I was the kind of man worth saving. And I thought about Madison's fake tears in a story I'd once read about somebody else's ruined family that had stuck with me for reasons I couldn't fully explain until now. And I thought about my son's voice on that recording, arguing about spending money instead of arguing about the lie itself. I thought most of all about a mailbox in Cherry Hills that still had my name on it, 6 months after they'd buried an empty casket and called it grief. No, I told Frank. Serve the notice on the morning of the 16th exactly as planned. But I'm not going to a courtroom to watch this unwind on paper. I already spent 5 months being erased quietly in a cabin nobody could find. I am done being handled quietly. Frank studied me for a long moment, the way he used to study a contract for a clause he didn't like the shape of. What are you going to do, Walter? I looked out the window at the first real snowfall of December settling over the mountains, the same mountains that had once swallowed a plane, and, for a while, a man's entire life along with it. I'm going to buy a suit, I said, and I'm going to be in that ballroom on the 20th of December. And when the priest asks if anyone objects to this marriage, I intend to be standing close enough that he doesn't have to ask twice. The morning of December 20th arrived clear and cold, the kind of hard blue Colorado sky that makes everything underneath it look sharper than it is. I stood in front of the mirror in my hotel room at 9 a.m., wearing a charcoal suit Frank had helped me select the week before, and I did not recognize the man looking back at me. Not because the beard was different, or because I had lost nearly 20 pounds since the crash, but because the man in the mirror looked like someone who had finally stopped performing patience. Marcus Webb served as my driver that morning, though driver undersold what he had become to me over 3 months. He didn't say much on the ride downtown, just glanced at me once in the rearview mirror outside the ballroom and said, "You don't have to do this the loud way, Walter. There's still time to let Frank's paperwork do the talking." "I know," I said. "You're doing it the loud way anyway." "I am," he nodded, like a man who had expected exactly that answer and respected it anyway. Frank was already inside, seated quietly near the back with a folder on his lap. Technically there as an invited guest of the Kirkland family's attorney whom he'd known for years, a relationship that had let him slip into the room without questions. The unsealed court order sat inside that folder, along with a certified letter that had, at that exact moment, already been delivered by process server to Roy's home in Cherry Hills, timed by Frank down to the hour to arrive precisely when Roy would be at the venue and unable to intercept it, unable to warn anyone, unable to do anything but receive the news secondhand, too late to matter. The ballroom looked exactly the way I had quietly funded it to look. Orchids from Ecuador cascading down a 20-foot archway, a 12-piece orchestra tuning in the corner, 300 guests in their finest clothes, filling gilded chairs beneath restored 1920s chandeliers, all of them believing they were witnessing the seamless continuation of a family fortune rather than its unraveling. I stood in the back hallway, out of sight, and watched through a gap in the double doors as my son took his place at the altar, in a suit that fit him too well, standing straighter than I had seen him stand in years, believing, in that moment, that he had gotten away with everything. Roy stood beside him as best man, my brother in a rented tuxedo, playing the role of proud family patriarch at a wedding funded by a death he had helped manufacture. I felt something in my chest that I want to describe honestly, because this story only means anything if I am honest about it. I did not feel triumphant standing in that hallway. I felt tired and sad, in a way that had nothing to do with money at all. The orchestra began. Vanessa entered on her father's arm, radiant in white, and for a moment I let myself simply watch the ceremony unfold the way any guest would, the officiant's opening words, the readings, the exchange of rings that Derek and Vanessa had chosen from a jeweler I had, weeks earlier, quietly insured was paid in full without their knowledge. And then the officiant reached the part of the ceremony where he asked, as officiants always do, whether anyone present had any reason the marriage should not proceed. A formality. Nobody in that room expected to matter. I pushed the double doors open. I want to tell you it was a dramatic moment. a room full of gasps and dropped champagne flutes, the way it might play out in a film. The truth was quieter, and, I think, more devastating for exactly that reason. I walked down the center aisle at an even pace, in a suit that fit me the way suits used to fit me before a plane crash, and 4 months of broth and recovery had changed my body permanently, and for the first several seconds, nobody in that room recognized me at all. I was simply an older man in a well-tailored suit, walking somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. It was Roy who saw me first, halfway down the aisle, and I watched the exact moment recognition hit him, watched the color leave his face so completely and so fast that for a second I thought he might actually collapse where he stood. "Oh my God," Roy said, loud enough that the words carried across the entire silent room. Derek turned to see what his uncle was looking at, and I watched my son's face do something I will remember for the rest of my life. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even shock. Exactly. Not at first. It was the specific, sickening expression of a man doing math in real time, watching every number he had built his new life on suddenly fail to add up. "Dad?" Derek said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable like a boy's voice. Not a 29-year-old groom's. I stopped at the front row, close enough to the altar that the officiant, a kind-faced older man who had absolutely no idea what he had just walked into, looked between Derek and me with growing alarm. "I'm sorry," I said to him quietly, my voice steady, because I had rehearsed this exact sentence more times in that hotel room than I would ever admit. "I do have a reason. My name is Walter Hale. I am this man's father. 9 months ago, I was declared legally dead in a fraudulent probate filing, based on falsified evidence submitted by my brother Roy Hale, standing beside my son right now, and my son knew. I have a court order in my attorney's possession confirming that as of this morning, that death certificate has been formally vacated, and I am, in fact, very much alive." The room did not gasp all at once. It happened in waves, whispers rippling backward through 300 guests, like a stone dropped in still water, phones lifting out of pockets before anyone could stop them, the officiant taking an involuntary step back from the altar as though the ground beneath it had shifted. "Dad," Derek said again, moving toward me, his hands out in front of him in a gesture that might have been reaching for me or might have simply been trying to hold something up that was already falling. "Dad, I can explain. I swear to God, I can explain. I didn't. I never wanted." "You told Roy," I said, and my voice did not rise, which I think unsettled him more than shouting would have, "that I would understand. Do you remember writing that, Derek? Dad would understand. He always wanted me set up. I have that email. I have a recording of you and your uncle discussing an audit you were hoping would never happen. I have $18,000 in wire transfers to a man named Curtis Boone, who forged testimony from a state trooper who does not exist under that name in any personnel file in Alaska. I spent 4 months in a cabin so far off the grid that I couldn't tell anyone I was alive even if I had wanted to. And in that time, you buried me, took what wasn't yours, and used it to buy your way into a family that thinks old money doesn't ask questions." Vanessa had gone pale beside Derek, her bouquet lowering slowly to her side, and I watched her turn, not toward Derek, but toward her own mother, seated in the front row, with an expression I recognized instantly, because I had seen a version of it on Roy's face only moments before. It was the look of someone recalculating an entire future in the space of a single breath. "This is insane," Roy said, finding his voice, though it came out too loud, too fast. The voice of a man trying to talk his way out of a room that had already made up its mind about him. "Walter, you don't understand. We thought you were dead. Everyone thought you were dead. The plane, the search. We did everything by the book. You paid a man $18,000 to lie under oath, Roy," I said. "There is no version of the book where that's how it's done." Frank stood from his seat near the back at that moment, folder in hand, and began walking calmly toward the altar, and something about the sight of him, my old friend in his own dark suit, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had done exactly this kind of work for 40 years, seemed to finally convince the room that this was not a misunderstanding that would resolve itself in a private hallway. It was real. It was happening in front of 300 witnesses, half of whom I recognized as Denver's most prominent investors, judges, and business owners. The exact audience Vanessa's mother had spent a year curating for precisely this kind of spectacle, though not the one she had intended. Mrs. Kirkland, Frank said politely, addressing Vanessa's mother directly. I'm sorry to interrupt your daughter's wedding. My name is Frank Delgado. I'm Mr. Hale's attorney. I want to be very clear that none of this is your daughter's fault, or your family's fault. But I would strongly advise pausing this ceremony until certain financial matters involving the groom's inheritance are resolved, given that a significant portion of today's expenses were, as of this morning, funded through assets currently under legal dispute. That sentence did more work in that room than anything I had said. I watched Vanessa's father, a real estate developer who had built his own fortune with a reputation for ruthless due diligence, lean over to his wife and whisper something sharp and fast. I watched 300 guests begin, quietly, to reach for coats. Derek was still standing at the altar, and for a moment, everyone else in that room seemed to fall away, and it was just the two of us, the way it had been for so many years after Eleanor died. Just a father and a son, trying to figure out how to be a family with half the pieces missing. Why didn't you call me the second you were found? Derek asked, and his voice had dropped low enough, now that only I could really hear it. You were alive for 4 months, and you let me bury you. You let me grieve you, Dad. Do you know what that did to me? I looked at my son, at the tears now genuinely running down his face, and I understood, with a clarity that hurt more than anything Roy or Vanessa's calculating stillness had shown me that day, that Derek's grief and Derek's greed had never actually been separate things to him. He had mourned me honestly in his own way, and profited from that mourning without ever letting himself see the two as connected, the same way a man can love a house and still not notice it's built on a fault line. I found out what you and Roy did before I found out how much I'd missed you, I said quietly. That's the honest answer, Derek. I spent 6 weeks reading proof that my own son helped bury me alive so he could afford orchids from Ecuador. I needed to know the truth before I let myself feel anything else. He had no answer for that. There isn't one. I did not stay for what happened next, though Frank and Marcus filled in the details for me over the following days. The wedding did not continue. Vanessa's father pulled his family out within the hour, and by that evening, according to Frank, the Kirkland's attorney had already reached out about the possibility of a very different kind of legal proceeding regarding fraud in the marriage they'd nearly entered their daughter into unknowingly. Roy was arrested 6 days later on charges of estate fraud, forgery, and bribery of a public official, charges that Curtis Boone, faced with the recording Marcus had captured, agreed to testify against him for in exchange for a reduced sentence of his own. Roy is currently awaiting trial. Frank tells me it does not look promising for him. The probate court moved swiftly once the fraud was formally established. Every asset transferred out of my estate under the false death certificate was returned, the house, the accounts, Hale Capital itself, though the process of unwinding a year of Derek's spending, much of it, ironically, funded by money I myself had quietly poured into that wedding, took considerably longer than any of us expected. I did not press criminal charges against my son. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters more than the decision itself. It was not forgiveness, not yet. It was the simple recognition that I had spent his entire life building a version of fatherhood that never once asked him to face real consequences. And putting him in a courtroom now, after everything, felt less like justice and more like finally handing him the bill for a debt I had let accumulate for 29 years without ever once presenting it. What I did instead was something closer to what Nadia had once said to me in that cabin, though it took me months to understand she'd been talking about Derek before I even knew there was a Derek problem to solve. I removed him from any position of authority at Hale Capital, effective immediately. I did not remove him from my will, but I restructured his inheritance into a trust with conditions, real ones, tied not to grand gestures like a wedding, but to years, actual years, of demonstrated honesty and accountability, verified not by me, but by an independent trustee Frank appointed, someone with no emotional stake in giving Derek the benefit of the doubt the way I always had. Vanessa called off the engagement within the week. I heard secondhand that she has since become engaged to someone else, someone whose family fortune came with fewer complications attached. I don't think about her often. She was never really the point. I went back to Talkeetna in the spring, exactly 1 year after the crash that started all of this. Nadia was still there, 60 miles from the nearest paved road, feeding stray dogs off her porch the way she always had. I brought her something I'd had made in Denver, a small brass plaque with her late husband's name on it, meant for the trail marker near where she'd found me, because she'd mentioned once, in that offhand way people mention the things that matter most to them, that no one had ever properly marked where he'd died, helping someone else, years before I ever arrived. She didn't cry when I gave it to her. She just nodded. The way she nodded at almost everything, like a woman who had long ago stopped expecting the world to explain itself and had simply decided to keep doing the right thing anyway. "Did you find out?" she asked me, as we stood together looking out over the tree line. "Whether you were worth saving." I thought about my son's face at that altar, about the son I still call every Sunday now, slowly, carefully. The way you rebuild a bridge you know has already failed once. I thought about Roy awaiting trial, about a mailbox in Cherry Hills that finally has the right name on it again. "I think I'm still finding out," I told her. But I stopped being afraid of the answer. "If you made it this far, I want to know what you would have done in that ballroom. Would you have walked down that aisle the way I did, in front of every witness? Or would you have let the courts settle it quietly out of sight? Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button, because there is always another family, another lie, and another man walking back through a door nobody expected to open again.